Hi, Natalie.
Hello.
Thank you very much for coming. Natalie Hyacinth is the researcher for the project called Everyday Integration, and she's based at the School of Sociology at the University of Bristol. So thank you very much for coming along, Natalie, and answering some of my questions about integration.
Great, thank you.
So my first question is pretty broad. It's so what's generally meant by the term integration?
Well, I think integration commonly refers to, put it rather simply, one group moving to an area or territory that isn't their home place. And integration usually refers to the kind of mixing or blending in of this group moving to another area. So in political terms, this usually refers to migration and sort of the idea of one group moving into what is often referred as a host nation. So moving and integrating into a new country or home. And the integration, once they've moved and settled, often revolves around how adapted or not adapted they are to their new place. There are other ideas of integration that relate to themes of sociality. So how well people get on, how well is a newcomer welcomed into a neighborhood or a community. And I think in our world with increased mobility and sort of less stability, in some ways, integration takes on a really new and important meaning as people are moving and traveling all of the time now, of course, less so with COVID. So integration can refer to how well someone settles into a new community for a long or short period of time.
So I mentioned that you're working on the Everyday Integration Project. Can you tell us a little bit more about that project?
Yes, sure. So Everyday Integration is a collaborative research project based between the University of Bristol, Bristol City Council, and over 30 community organisations across the city. Now we understand that integration, the word itself, is quite a contested term. So we're very aware of that. So what we are trying to do in a sense with the project is to kind of flip the common assumptions about integration on its head. So commonly, integration, especially from a policy, governmental perspective, has been very sort of top-down. So we are alternatively taking a more bottom-up, local and inclusive approach to integration to provide an alternative or understanding about what integration means and how it works in people's lives, everyday lives. So we see integration as something that involves everyone, not just migrants. And particularly, we are keen not to spotlight migrants as usual suspects, as they often are in integration debates and discussions. So integration for us is about how we can all work together to make our neighbourhoods stronger and not just simply pointing the finger at certain groups at not being integrated. So we take a local approach, for example, through discussions of integration that feed from community partners that we work from, because integration is often discussed at a national level and not a local level and can be quite abstract. And as especially in the last year, as we know with COVID, we have mostly lived our lives locally. So we feel that it's very important to think about how local neighbourhood relations can help or hinder integration. So yes, that's a little bit about the project.
So you talk about integration being a contested term, to put it mildly.
Yes.
Can you tell us, well, whether you think it's necessary to take a critical approach to integration, and if you do think it's necessary, why?
Yes, I think it's very important to take a very critical approach to integration, because integration discussions so far have often reflected a sort of one-way approach. The focus has so far often, as I said before, been on migrants and how they can integrate, instead of taking a more broader look at some of the policies and practices around that issue that can make it difficult for communities to integrate into a new neighbourhood or area. So I think it's very important to be critical and to closely examine views of integration, because the ways in which the government spotlights migrants and migrant communities can in fact be very dangerous, right? So, you know, in recent years, we've seen the very scary rise of the far right and anti-migrant communities and anti-immigrant groups. So discussions on how non-integrated certain communities are, as has been a sort of policy practice of government for many years, can actually fuel these groups and fuel hatred in a sense. So I think that it's actually crucially important that we take a critical view of integration, because if not, dangerous ideas can be left to fester, and these can be quite dangerous for immigrant groups. And as I mentioned, you know, discussions of integration so far, I think, have created a sort of us and them rhetoric, which places the burden of integrating onto the migrant group, who sometimes have faced, you know, really tough experiences getting to a host nation. And so they should be treated with care rather than with suspicion. So I think a more critical approach is necessary to sort of open up lines of dialogue and just to be more caring to people that have often gone through a lot. And they don't need this kind of extra, you know, feelings of suspicion or hatred around their new home.
So what kind of policies are generally included when governments and local authorities use the term integration?
I think often the policy of multiculturalism, and of course, you know, we've had a lot of discussions on how multiculturalism has failed, apparently, which is almost another way of saying that integration has failed. In the UK, we have had the release in recent years of the Integration Strategy Report by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, which was a cross-department action plan for England. Also, I often think about Paul Gilroy, which is not exactly a policy, but it's more kind of, you know, an academic, philosophical way of thinking about integration. He often talks about how migrants change when they move, but also how the host nation changes also, and it's sort of a two-way process. So I think that's something that we are trying to do as part of the Everyday Integration project. We're trying to hopefully change the policy of local government so that instead of seeing integration from a policy perspective of being a sort of one-way street of one group having to integrate into another, instead making sure that policy sees it as a two-way process, as something that both parties have to be actively involved with.
So to ask the provocative question, do you think that an anti-racist integration strategy is possible?
I believe an anti-racist integration policy is possible, but I think it's also really important to think about ideas of intersectionality. So it's very, very important to think about the ways that integration and racism and these sorts of policies affect people in different ways. So I believe it is possible, but only possible with open dialogue and debate. I just mentioned before Paul Gilroy, who's a really interesting academic writer on this kind of work. And as I said, he talks about the way that integration is a two-way process. So I think in terms of racism, that's something that we will need to discuss a lot more. So we've just had, you know, the race disparity report recently published, which has brought up a lot of debates and discussions around racism. So I think an anti-racist integration policy is only possible until we have some very frank honest and open discussions about racism in the UK and about integration. And so far, these two policy sort of areas, so policies around anti-racism, policies around integration, haven't really come together very much. They're still very much in separate fields. And I know that in terms of the governmental departments, they are in way separate departments that hardly ever speak to each other. So I think it's really important that we open the lines of dialogue and be very honest about racism and how racism is a very crucial factor in integrative experiences for new migrant communities. So yeah, I think it's possible, but with a lot of work and with a lot of dialogue.
Thanks very much, Natalie. Maybe we're thinking about the cart before the horse, and maybe actually if we are successfully transform into an anti-racist society, we won't need integration anymore.
Yes, that's a very good point. I mean, that would be ideal. That would be the ideal. But I think until we have honest discussions about racism, which, you know, I think through COVID, we've seen how it can be very difficult to talk about racism, because even with what's happened in the last year, so for example, with a lot of anti-Asian hate crime, people have been very shocked that people can be like that. And I think once we sort of just become very honest about what does happen and what does occur, and not try to sweep it under the carpet, then we can start to really get to an understanding of how we can, make integration not even necessary anymore.
Thanks very much, Natalie. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.